This is the Master Marketer Show, powered by Proofpoint Marketing. Each week, we explore the mindsets, skill sets, and tool sets the top B2B marketers use to drive results. Gain actionable insights, one masterful, revenue-generating success story at a time. Let's get started.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Master Marketer Show. Today we're doing something a little bit different, taking it back a bit, and it's just going to be three marketers shooting the shit about customer research and why it's important. That's our topic for today, gentlemen. So we got James Ricks and Joseph Lewin with me here today. So I guess maybe to get us started, a lot of marketing that's done out there is, we were talking about this before we hit record, is kind of done based on assumptions and conjecture that are not really based on any insight. It's sort of like, well, I think this thing's important as a marketer. And then we go and we create a campaign and we test it out and see what happens. We don't do that. We do it differently. So I think that's maybe a good place to start is, the why of customer interviews and customer research is we don't want to be doing that. We don't want to be making just random assumptions about what's happening in the market or how people think or why they're thinking in a certain way or why they're feeling a certain way, etc. So I guess I'm going to stop there. Anything you all want to add?
I mean, that's exactly it. If you're not hearing it straight from the customer, then it may as well be, a completely different language. Like it's just completely irrelevant. If it's not the words they use, it's not going to connect. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. And there's different stages of like customer interviews you can do. It can be leading up to becoming a customer. So that's like going to influence your marketing. That could be once they are a customer, that's going to influence your customer service and the way that you take care of your customers after that. But no matter what you do, if it's not using their own words, it's over their heads, it's not going to matter to them.
It could be post-mortem too. I mean, that's always a powerful one. Like it could be post-mortem after a customer leaves. It could be post-mortem after you lose a deal. Both of those are great opportunities to understand and get different insights in terms of like the why, because the why is what's important.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and what you're doing during a customer interview really depends on what your goals are. And it's going to be hard to encapsulate everything you need in an interview or even in a set of interviews because it really just depends on what your goal is. But I mean, I've worked in quite a few different areas of marketing. So product marketing, focus more on the writing side, both for blog writing or copywriting, and just general content creation, videos and stuff like that. And what you need from your customers is going to vary depending on what type of marketing you're doing. So, I mean, if you're in the product marketing side, doing those interviews is important to help work with the sales and product team to define what the product actually is. And maybe there's some things about your product that you're assuming that your customer actually has a very different viewpoint on it. And that could be something even about why they use the product to begin with. So you've made some assumptions, you've made a product, people start using it. Once you start doing customer interviews from the product marketing side, you start going, wait, you're using our product to do what? And they're like, oh yeah, we've changed all these different things and we've used these custom fields to do X, Y, and Z if it was in the software space. And you're like, oh, that's not what this software's for at all. But then it starts to go, man, there's this whole other segment of people that if we make a few small changes to our software, we could like open up a totally different market. And without doing research from the product marketing side, you're not going to know that. But then on the flip side, if it's for copywriting, any good copywriter worth their salt is going to do customer interviews because your customer has language that they use to describe the challenges they're facing, why they chose you specifically, what makes you different than other people. And if you're not getting that language from the customer, there's going to be a disconnect no matter what. And most of the time when you interview 5 to 10 customers, you're going to start hearing some common themes across where you're like, oh, wow, that's a word I wouldn't have used to describe. But now 3 out of 5 of our current customers that we've interviewed use this same word. Let's make sure to test that out in our next ad set or, landing page or whatever.
Brought to mind two things. One is a story actually that relates just to that. There's a popular to-do list app that I use in my life. And they recently, their marketing team put out this blog post about this big feature of their software that they thought no one used. And it was this big blog post about why they're taking it away and how they feel like it's, the best thing to do for the platform. Turns out that was one of the main features that power users of this app use and rely on for their, setting up filters and things like that show tasks in specific buckets. Anyway, big oversight in missing really customer research that would have led them to know how important that feature was. I didn't leave. I still love them, but I maybe some did, so maybe they've lost some goodwill, with it because of that. The other thing is customer interviews and research can also help you gauge how clearly your message is understood by people. So one of my, and we're going to get into favorite questions, I think, that we ask, but if you can ask questions that ask something along the lines of what would you describe that we do to someone that doesn't know what we do, and what they give you back is the core of what they understand about what you do and how closely that matches to your mission statement or your motto or whatever it is that you do, it better, and ideally it aligns with that. But if not, you have some learning there that you can improve messaging, improve the way you go to market, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the most common ones that we like to do is you start with stakeholder interviews first, for a variety of reasons. One of which is to understand, okay, what do the founders, the sales team, the kind of the executives, the leaders, etc. What do they believe? What do they think? What do they know? And then you test that against what are your customers actually saying. And it's amazing how big that disconnect is at times. Not always, but sometimes you get into it and then you kind of turn it back around, like, you guys are saying this. Your customers are way over here saying something totally different. So either you don't understand them, they don't understand you, you're going after the wrong market. It could be a bunch of different reasons why that disconnect exists. But something doesn't jive, and you're never going to be able to scale if that continues to be the case.
Yeah, and I think one piece with all of that, that's important to keep in mind is the language that you need to use is the language that's going to connect with a customer, not the language that you like as a marketers or the founder likes or whatever. And I know that for people who are used to doing this kind of stuff, often that sounds cliche, but it's so often that the people who are approving marketing messages are the executive team in a company, and they just go, oh, I don't like that wording. And I've specifically had that happen before. I was paid to do customer research a while ago, and there was this specific word that came up over and over and over again. It was camaraderie, and every single interview that I did, that word came up. Now, I don't especially like that word. I don't think, if I'm putting on my words that I like hat, it certainly doesn't fit into that bucket. It's kind of weird, a weird word, but every single customer used it. So to me, that's something that needs to go on the website. That needs to be front and center. That needs to be something that's used, at least tested out. But when I presented this, the people that were in charge of then taking that and putting it in messaging specifically cut that word out. And they're like, yeah, this is great. We really like it, but there's some things we're going to leave out, like camaraderie. And I'm like, no, don't leave that out. It was the most used word out of anything. So, just making sure that you recognize that it's not what you like. It's what is the market saying, and let the market decide what language to use and what your product is, because they know better.
So even within our one company, we're going to get some disagreements here. I'm going to challenge that just a little bit, and the reason why it just came up with a client. I don't get to do these very often anymore, but I was just doing some strategic narrative work for a client, doing some interviews, and same thing actually happened. Like, we recommended something, and now it's a much smaller organization, founder led still, owner led. And one of the pieces of feedback was like, you know what? I get it. I believe this word is overused in the industry. I understand why they're using it. I believe it's redundant, and I just think if I have to see it every single time, I'm going to hate myself, kind of thing. So enough. I think there's there's a happy medium there. And the other example I'll give you is for our own too. I mean, Gabby and I have had countless, I don't know if they're arguments, but like discussions about, like, 'cause I was usually in your shoes. I'm like, look, I don't care what you think. Like, this is what the customers are using. She's like, I don't care. I don't like it. Right. And at some point you got to realize like, well, because our company is still very much founder led and we're like, this is our baby and we look at it every single day. Like you have to be okay with what's there. Like, this is where the thesaurus can oftentimes be your best friend. Like, all right, fine. It's not camaraderie. What's another way to say it? That's still going to resonate. The other thing out there too, I think, and this is very much up for discussion, but the flip side of customer interviews, and also not even the flip side, but getting maybe deeper into how to do them well, is, I forget what the exact quote is, but it's like, and I forget who said it, to be fair, but it goes something along the lines of like, people won't, what is it? People don't know what they want. They won't tell you what they think, and they won't say, and they won't do what they say, or something of that nature, right? So, just because somebody uses a word, or just because they say that they do something, or that they think something, or feel about something in a certain way, doesn't actually mean that it's going to resonate, right? So I think there's an art and a trick, maybe even, to delving into that and really understanding, okay, well, is this really what you mean?
Yeah, I think if, in that example, Mike, that you shared of the client, I was in that call as well. And in that case, they're really trying to differentiate themselves as a company with the rest of the industry. And so if not using the same words that everyone else is using gets that done, then I think that's, we're getting into the weeds here of this, but you have to be willing to take what you learn from these interviews, even if it doesn't align with what you hoped they'd say, and do something about it. And if that means use words that they're using, great. But if you need to not use those words, and what you learn from that interview is this is the words that the rest of the industry is using, we're going to use different words to create a category, for example, then you still have got an excellent learning that you can't get any other way, from these interviews. With the stakeholder interviews, I know we're not talking a lot about stakeholder interviews, but one of the questions that I love asking in those interviews is, what do you wish people knew? And they'll usually throw out like, we're more expensive than other people, but this is why, and that's where you start to get to the nuggets of what actually matters to them. Then you take that to the customers and say, did you know this? Do you know this? You validate that, and now you have something actually that you can take and implement again. But you just got to be willing to use and do what you learn. Otherwise, you might as well have not done the interviews.
Yeah, James, it's interesting. Oh, go ahead, Joseph. Go for it.
You brought up a good point in there about, in a sense, like it has to be something that you actually can take action on, and it kind of ties together what Mike was sharing and James, what you were sharing, and that's if you don't have buy-in from whoever's going to actually be implementing this language. So, like, we're an agency. We work with with customers. They have their sales team, they have their executive team, they have their marketing team, and we have to try to figure out a way to get the best thing that we can actually in front of the customer. And so, in the end of the day, language that's much better than what they're using, that's closer to what the customer's saying, but that the executive team actually feels comfortable sharing in a sales meeting, that in the end of the day is better messaging than the perfect messaging that perfectly aligns with what the customer's saying, but that the team is never actually going to use. I think there's another tangent we could take maybe later on in the conversation, if it makes sense, about how to test some of that stuff out early on to bring some data behind what you're doing. But I know Mike had something else to share on this topic.
Oh, I was gonna kind of go in the same direction there in terms of, I think, James, what you brought up is, there's this way of thinking, like, oh, just the market will tell you what to do. Yes and no, right? I think in a very established market, maybe that's the case. But even then, like, the reality is again, sometimes people will say one thing and they will do something different when they're presented with it in a different way. So I think the idea is, again, kind of maybe even going full circle, is what you were saying, Joseph. You have to come into the interview with an objective. What are you trying to find out? What questions are you trying to answer? What do you need to know? Are you trying to validate messaging? Are you trying to validate a position? Are you trying to validate whether something is or is not a problem? Whatever, right? And then based on what you find out, that's an insight. It doesn't mean you have to use it in a one-to-one direct way. It's like, oh, well, they say it's a problem. That means it's a problem I have to tackle. Maybe, maybe not. Why is it a problem? Right? Well, how do you feel about that problem? Like, whatever. There's a bunch of different things you can gather from it, and you build that insight into, and again, you can, I guess you can think of like a coin, right? You can take one side or the other. Both are going to be valid. So.
Yeah. And that's where it needs to be said that, if you do one customer interview with one person and you go and immediately implement everything that they say or switch entirely to everything that one customer talked about, then you've missed the point. You need to be doing.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I don't know if we want to put a number on it, but I'd say at least 10 to 15, right? So you get statistical significance of this many people are saying this over and over and over again. Maybe more, maybe it's 100, maybe, I don't know.
I mean, it depends for what, right? I mean, we're
Sure.
talking customer interviews. If you're going to do 100 interviews, you're going to be doing interviews till the cows come home, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
for me, the minimum is 5. With 5 interviews, I feel like, and again, you have to have a plan. Meaning, okay, my plan is to talk to these types of people, and they're all going to be those types of people, and I'm going to talk to them about the same exact thing. So, I mean, obviously, the conversation can veer, but you sort of, as long as you have a similar enough conversation with similar enough people at similar enough companies in similar types of positions, having similar types of challenges, et cetera, right? Now you've got enough of a qualitative data set to actually do something with. But yeah, a lot of the time I've made that mistake before. Like, sometimes people aren't very charismatic, like the people that you interview, right? But then you get somebody that just is a very great conversation. Like, oh my God, this person really knows their shit. I'm going to do what they say. And they're an outlier, but you don't know that. And you just, so like you have to be careful about like how attached you get to the person on the other side too.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I have another
that's a great
example
point.
of that. I just finished a round of customer interviews, and one of the things that I was trying to understand was what sort of podcasts, they listen to in their professional or their personal lives. And I think I did 5 interviews, and 4 of them said, podcast's not really my thing. I work from home now, so I don't have a commute, so I don't listen to a ton. But the 5th one that I had today said, I am a podcast fiend, so you gotta do enough that you get what you're looking for. And not that I was looking for, yes, we listen to podcasts, that's the answer. I'm looking to validate other things, but you know what I'm saying? Like, you have to, if I would have stopped at 3 and never got to that person, we potentially could miss the opportunity to create a relationship at scale with that type of person.
And sometimes you got to follow up
Right.
with another research medium, right? So let's assume you did 5 interviews, 4 say, nope, don't listen to podcasts. 1 say you do. Let's assume we have a hunch that podcasts are an important medium. Well, there are there's third-party data you can gather, but then you can also put out a survey to their customer base and say, hey, do you listen to podcasts? Yes or no? And which podcast do you listen to? Whatever. And depending on what that comes back with, maybe it's 40% of their customer base listens to podcasts. Well, that's a pretty large set, right? So maybe, again, I'm totally making this up. We didn't do that yet, but I think that's the thing, is you don't always end with customer interviews.
Yeah, and I think there's another piece here that I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes, but I'll just mention it as in the research that you're doing. First of all, I think a huge mistake is to just do interviews and then feel like you've done customer interviews and you're good to go. Like, if you're working on a project, you're working on a campaign, or or if you're an agency and you're coming in to do work and you really need to understand what's going on, you need to do customer interviews and really like dive into that 5, 10, 15 interviews, something like that. But customer interviews aren't something that you just do and you're done. You should be consistently figuring out ways to get in front of customers. And that could be having people on your team on the customer experience side getting on, It could be something where, you're building one-on-one relationship with the sales team or marketing team or whatever, creating content with your ideal customers just so that you have a pulse on the market, because then you're continually gathering data consistently in real time. And I mean, to me, that's super important. But a couple other ways of doing research alongside customer interviews that I think are really important would be listening in on sales calls if you have a sales team, because there's other types of information that you're going to find in other questions. Like, for instance, like you're sharing, Mike, people don't necessarily know or say the same things that they actually would ask themselves. You're interviewing them, they're thinking more about it than they ever would, or analyzing themselves, or thinking about what you're going to think about them. There's all kinds of factors that play into interviews. Whereas somebody who's on a sales call, if they ask a specific question, there's a reason they're asking that question. And if you hear that same question 5 times, well, that's a question that you need to make sure you have content to answer. And no matter how many customer interviews you do, you might not uncover that kind of content. And also just like, how is our message being presented by the sales team? And is it clear and concise? And are people understanding it and paying attention to body language if it's a recorded call and whatever? So you can start to see, where is our message falling flat, and where do we need to make some changes? And I think that's a really important area of customer research outside of interviews. It's important to add into the mix if possible.
Yeah, I think you if you want to pull on that thread maybe a little bit further even, I think the main thing that you brought up is it's not a one and done, right? And the reason is, like, a lot of the time when people do the customer interviews, like, they're trying to build out their ICP, right? I mean, we create that for clients. The reality is that the ICP document, once you have it, it's not static. There's always insights that come out. They're like, oh, well, we didn't know about that yet. I didn't realize that customers care about this. So now you add that in, right? And then maybe over time, again, the adjustments are smaller and smaller increments usually, until you maybe go into a new market, or you release a new feature or whatever it is.
Or a new competitor enters the market, or
exactly.
Whatever, new technology. And, there's all kinds of different factors that could come up. Yeah. And if you don't have your finger on it, you might not know.
Yep. The example that comes, like, this is another example of something that might be the cause for doing customer interviews, but, something like a global pandemic rolling around, or a economic recession, like that might be a good time to figure out, what do people think and feel today? Do you remember how many commercials from car companies, it seemed like, during the pandemic said, we're here with you. We're here with you, that during this unprecedented time, we're here with you. So buy this Ford, right, truck. It was like, that feels like marketing that was just run past the executives. Like, yeah, that sounds good. That's I don't care about that. Right. So things like that, large economic events, geez, I hope we don't have another pandemic to add to COVID, but something like that, any time where the market's like, okay, what's going on? It's a good time to go and hear from them.
Total tangent, but the reason I'm laughing is, I don't know if you all have noticed this. We were well ahead of this. We've been talking about relationships for years. I don't know if you all listen to commercials, like everyone's talking about, when times are tough, relationships matter. It's all the financial institutions and this and the other. I'm like, good Lord. Really? Like,
yeah.
I mean, yes, but come on.
Yeah.
How about
they
it
always
all
matter, not just now.
Yeah,
right.
let's not get back to that.
It's like they only matter now. Now when you think you're going to start losing business, now relationships matter. Yeah. Okay. There's the reason I bring it up. There's a specific, I forget who it's for. It's on Spotify. I get this commercial all the time. And every time Gabby and I are driving in the car, and we'll both look at each other like, oh my God, they said relationships. Anyway.
That's true though.
Yeah. One other thing I think is, well, go ahead.
No, go for it.
One other thing, talking about more of like, I know we're kind of bouncing all over, but hey, this is fun. We're having a good conversation.
Marketing talk radio. I'm telling you, it's the next thing.
I love it. One other thing with the structure around interviews, like I do think if you're you need to set your objectives of what you're going for. And there are some questions you should probably ask exactly the same. But then I found that, you have 5, 6, 7 interviews. You start learning a couple things in the first few interviews, and then you're either digging deeper with the next person if you really feel confident that's something that is going on, you kind of preface with that and say, how do you feel about this? Do you agree with that? Which I know is leading, but that lets you then go 2 or 3 times deeper with the third person you're talking to, and then the fifth person you're talking to, you can go way deeper. And that's the kinds of insights that I find end up being typically most valuable. Like, you have your 4 or 5 canned questions that you're asking everybody just to make sure you're getting common language. Like, how do you describe this company and what they do, whatever. That's one you should ask to everybody, or, in the right, depending on your goals, you should ask that one every time. But that would be an example of one you'd ask every time, because you want to get the string across everyone. But to me, what I'm trying to do in a customer interview is get past that person's logic and get into their emotion. And it's the way that they feel about the company, the way they feel about the market, the way that when they're going to go, oh man, I love working with these guys because whatever. That's what I'm trying to get to. And so then most of the time you don't get that in your question set. You get that in the follow-up questions and, as you dig deeper. So it's, to me, the value of customer interviews, and when you really get the best stuff, that's when you're getting 2 or 3 layers deeper than what you had in your question set, and getting that customer to talk more and more, and to lean on Chris Voss from Never Split the Difference. It's the unknown unknowns. What are those hidden things that the customer doesn't know, that you don't know, but that when they say it, you're like, oh my God, that's what we're missing. And it's ultimately like connecting what's missing from what the stakeholders believe about themselves and their company and their messaging and the customer. And at some point, the customer is going to reveal some piece of information that helps you connect those 2 dots together. And, that's ultimately what you're going for.
Yeah, and I think that going off of you're talking about kind of getting past the logic and getting to the emotional response, if you will. I don't know if this is considered a hack or not, but one of my favorite ways to sort of get right into it as quickly as possible is asking a question like, and it sounds pretty general, but like, what's the worst day you've ever had on the job? Right? That forces them into a visceral emotional response right away. If they're willing to share it, it's like, oh my God, there's this one time it was just awful. This X, Y, and Z happened. Oh, well, why? Like, tell me more. Why was that so awful? Like, why did that make you feel this way? Right? It just allows you to bypass all the other logical bullshit, if you will. That's not bullshit, but and there's the flip side of that too, which is, tell me not the flip side. A couple of different ways to ask it, like, what keeps you up at night is another way to do it. On the flip side of that, it's, tell me about the, best day you've had on the job. Like, that's the other thing. Like, what is success? How do you feel about success, and why is that there? Like, those types of things, I think, can get you past the more logical answers.
This would be interesting. I almost wonder if we should role play doing this real time, because I think it's interesting. But to me, the key of what you just said is, once you ask that question and they respond, not just saying, okay, and then moving on to the next question. You said, tell me more. Why? So if I ask, before you started working with us, what were the problems that you were facing? And they say, we're having a hard time getting our message. If they're working with Proofpoint, we're having a hard time. Our message, it's not resonating. We're not creating enough demand. And then if I just say, okay, sweet, all right, we'll take a note of that and we'll fix that when we do your marketing. No, but you say, what kind of things were you hearing, or how did that make you feel? What part of your job were you stressed out about because this wasn't happening? That kind of thing. Then you get to the cool stuff where they're like, I needed to fix this, or else I was going to need to look for a new job, or I needed to hit this number, or, we were going to have to let people go, something like that. But you get, when you ask why, I think there's someone out there that said you should ask why 5 times, and then you really get to it. But they say something, why? Tell me more. They say something, tell me what that means. How did that make you feel? You can get really deep with that. And it's not just surface level, like an interrogation where you ask a question, they answer. You ask a question, they answer. It's not the way that you're not going to get anything meaningful out of that.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because these are the same things that when I'm working with our customers that have podcasts, working on how to ask better, more thoughtful questions. And sometimes it's like even summarizing a thought into your question to kind of help it go a little bit deeper. I'm trying to think of a good way to show that as an example. But, instead of just being like, tell me more about that, you're kind of going, man, it sounds like that was a really stressful time for you. And you could just stop with that and let them go. Or you could also go, if you need it more targeted because there's something specific and you don't want them just to go off on a tangent, you could go, man, that sounds like it was really stressful for you. Can you tell me a little bit more about how that level of stress affected X, Y, and Z? And that's helps you get a much more targeted answer, but also by talking about feeling, you saying it feels like, it sounds like, it looks like, again, going back to Chris Voss, I use his stuff all the time in conversation. It helps target the conversation on something specific, but also lets you get those more emotional responses from people.
Yeah. And it really gets at, which I think is where a lot of, maybe not a lot, but many marketers miss or stop too soon in these is they stop at like problems and challenges. It's like, and they'll dig deep, like, well, was this really a problem? Yada, yada, yada. Okay, great. But what you really need to understand is like, what are the skepticisms and hesitations that people have about making a decision? Right? It doesn't matter whether you're selling software, whether you're selling machinery, whether you're selling a service like we do. At the end of the day, there is going to be skepticism based on past experience. So you need to understand what the past experience is or was, and how did they feel about it? Because now that gives you insight that you can then use to address and actually test. So, Joseph, you're talking about like, how can we test it? I mean, one of the things that we do is, putting ads into market with new messaging before it's really completely fleshed out, and just seeing what's the response, or higher click-through rate, lower click-through rate, better engagement, lower engagement, whatever, right? And understanding, is it resonating? But the other thing is if you can get an insight like, hey, I tend to use this example a lot, but with this happens, I think, pretty often with software vendors, also with service vendors. Time to implementation, time to result is a major hesitation pretty consistently, right? But you need to, if you know that, now you can start testing and putting things in the market like, okay, let me get testimonials from customers, just quick little clips that specifically talk about time to result. Put that stuff out there and see if that makes any impact on, close rates and sales cycle length and all that kind of stuff. But it's like, unless you understand that hesitation exists, you don't really know that you need to address it. Doesn't mean that they don't have actual challenges they're trying to solve. But what's their hesitation about making a switch or choosing you as the new partner or vendor or whatever?
Yeah, those types of questions particularly apply if the customer interviews. The goal that you were trying to get out of those interviews is to understand what led them to making a purchasing decision. Those are huge, and you're right. I think a lot of people will stop at, what problem do you have and how do you feel, but really you need to, okay, once you've kind of gotten past that, you've identified that there's companies out there that can help you, whatever. What did you have to go through internally? What was the decision process like? What factors were considered, and that's where I found that this is a pro tip here, something to avoid. You want to avoid asking in general, but especially in customer interviews, double-barreled questions, which is a question inside of another question or a topic inside of a topic, right? Where you're saying, tell me about this, but also, and I think it's just, you get what I'm saying? Like, I can't even think of a good example, but we do it all the time. It's hard to not do, but it just helps your interviewee be able to focus on what you really want to get at instead of like trying to keep track of all these questions that you've asked. But I feel like those that usually happens like at that stage where you get past the problems and now you're starting to talk about some of the more intangible things.
Yeah, this is very tactical, like you're saying, James, but one of the perfect examples, which I hear all the time and I've fallen into the trap of using, it's like, well, tell me how you felt about that and what impact did that have on you? It's like, well, those are two separate questions. Tell me how you felt. Great, let's get that. And then you move on to what impact did this have? Because otherwise they're gonna go to one or the other and they're gonna forget about the other thing. So you're not gonna get the full insight.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and when we're talking about, I find that there's kind of two different ways that most people in the market end up having. They kind of fall into one of these these issues, and then if we're not careful in customer interviews, we're going to miss the other one. So either they have a problem, but they don't really associate. You haven't gotten to the pain, so they're going to talk all about the problem. They're not actually talking about the underlying pain that's causing that problem, or like vice versa. They have pain and they're going to talk about it, but they're associating that pain with the wrong problem. And especially if you're in a market where you do things really differently than other people, a lot of times you have to shift the way that people think about the problem and where that problem is coming from. So then it's like getting down where it is. So, whichever it is whether it's the problem or the pain that they understand, you really have to get the other one. And they sound like they're similar, but it really makes a big difference, because if the person's pain is, if somebody's blowing up all of their colleagues, and you're looking at that and you're like, what's going on? What's going on with this? You need to calm down. You're looking at the problem, but the problem is actually coming because they're a new parent and they were up all night the night before, and that the problem is coming from, or I guess maybe the problem is actually coming because they're not getting sleep because they have an 8-month-old, and that's an important factor to understand if you're going to try to address that issue. And if you're just making an assumption that the pain of having somebody blow up in a meeting, or be grumpy or whatnot, if you're going to try to address that, you need to understand if you're going to address it effectively. Maybe not the best example. It's just the first thing that comes to mind.
It's actually like a really good example from because it's making me think like, okay, what is the right solution for you, right? Well, if you're thinking if you're just trying to address I forget which one you called the pain. If you're just trying to address the fact that they're cranky in a meeting, it's like, oh, well, we need, communication training or whatever. Where like if you're thinking like benefits that need to be offered in an organization, when in reality what you really need is sponsored daycare or something, or like something of that sort, or extra days off or whatever. Like that's the real solution that's actually going to solve your problem.
Or scheduling a meeting an hour later
obviously it's
in the day.
What's that?
Or maybe trying to schedule meetings for that person an hour later in the day and take that into consideration, whatever it would be. But yeah, and I don't have a good like customer example of that, but that's kind of what you need to do. And if you're not finding those underlying, it's the underlying, again, it's the unknown. So if you're trying to address a grumpy person in a meeting and you don't have that extra information, you're really going to end up barking up the
I've got a real one for you if you want an example.
Let's do it.
This is from interviews we did with our customers and prospective customers and all that a while back. One of the common themes was, like, hey, we don't know, like, we need new ways to, new frameworks, right? New frameworks, new ways to build plans, right? Because we're struggling to do that. That's a pain. Okay. You could have just taken that at face value and said, great, let's do a new framework. Well, the why was, whatever they were doing before wasn't working as well. And they knew that they needed to make a change, but a lot of the people we end up working with generally work in companies where the CEO is not a marketer. They're oftentimes not even a salesperson. So what they end up having to do is they need a way to communicate and help them understand, the executive team and the board understand the change in strategy. Otherwise, they're going to get fired. Like, that's the actual reason. So you address those two things very differently in terms of how you communicate it. Right? Yes, you need the new framework and you need to help them understand it and teach it to them and all that stuff. But the way that you present it to them is different, knowing that like they're literally afraid they're going to lose their jobs if they don't fix this, and they don't know how because they can't communicate it in a good way. So I think that's kind of an example of where you're going at.
Yeah, I think that also leads into, I would try to address pain and problem. And then there's another one that's going to be really hard to find out unless you have just the right kind of person that you're interviewing. And I'm going to caveat this by saying I think internal politics are absolutely horrible and they're poison and detrimental. So I'm going to preface with that. So when I talk about this sometimes and I realize that my internal politics are good and I don't. I think they're toxic. So I'm glad we try our best to stay away from that stuff internally. But you have to understand, especially if you're working with companies, large enterprises, large organizations, there's internal politics involved. And so you have to also the actual pain and business problems, and be thinking in terms of how is this affecting this person on a personal level? And that gets back to the skepticism thing you were talking about. So not only thinking in terms of how can we mitigate business risks, that's a very logical thing. And if you're working with procurement committees and stuff, but if you want to get in way before the procurement committee's involved and be part of the process of like defining what the solution is going to be or whatever, you have to start figuring out how to get a champion internally way earlier on. And the type of person that's going to be a champion is going to be somebody who, in terms of how is this going to help me to grow in my career? Because the kind of person that's going to champion change and go against the grain, I know we're going a little off of customer interviews, but I think this is some of the most important stuff you can find if you're selling into an organization. So if the personality that's going to drive change against the status quo, typically, not always, but typically going to be a more driven person that wants to grow in their career, and they're willing to take a career risk in order to have the potential gain. With somebody like that, they're going to be savvy. They're going to be thinking about, if I bring in a new vendor, how is that going to affect my position in the organization? If I have to introduce this people on my team, what's that going to make me look like? And how is that going to help me, either grow in my career, or how is that going to totally destroy me if this goes wrong? And you have to, if you can learn what those pieces are and how they all work together, you can figure out ways to make your offer and your messaging as low risk as possible and as high upside reward on the personal side for working with you. It gets a little bit more complicated because that might be changing the product offering that you're doing or whatever. It gets a little more complex to solve that problem. But if you can get that kind of information out of somebody in an interview, that's like way beyond problem solution, way beyond pain, way beyond all of that, and into what really drives the needle at it to drive change at some of these big organizations.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, again, sort of a trick or hack, whatever you want to call it, one of my favorite questions to get to that type of information is, tell me about the last time you switched vendors. Because that, and you can even guide them by going, tell me about the last time that you had a bad experience switching vendors. Because again, this will give you an understanding of how do they think about change, and what types of, where have they been burnt before? What types of bad experience have they had before? And how is that going to impact future decision making? And again, one person, whatever, but you can usually start finding common threads of what are people worried about with a specific type of vendor change, whether that be a marketing agency, whether that be a CRM vendor, whether that be an ERP vendor. There's usually very specific types of things. Most people have had a change, either that they spearheaded or that they lived through based on somebody else's decision. And those experiences are what matters, right? To address kind of what you were talking about. And I think that's a good way to get at that line of questioning without making it feel like awkward or whatever.
Tell me about the last time you did something that benefited you and hurt the company. Probably not going to get very far with that.
Another thing I thought we'd talk about, a little tangential, but along the same lines of hearing from customers. Maybe calling it an interview is not the right way, but and this is a play from the software world, from SaaS, that's pretty popular. But forming a customer advisory board, which is a panel of selected customers that you've chosen that are kind of those champions. They're your loyal advocates. They're your evangelists. And setting up, I've done quarterly CAB calls, client advisory board calls, things like that. But those are also great places to get product feedback, market feedback, things like that. I've even took some messaging to that, but that's more of a call where all stakeholders are brought in, not just marketing. You got sales, you got customer success, you got everyone there, product. But I think this is a play that would be interesting for a lot of people that we work with professional services and med tech, biotech, things like that. E-commerce could even do this, forming a client advisory board saying, hey, we've noticed you've been a customer of ours for a long time. We see value in our relationship, and maybe you give them a discount on your services or something like that to thank them for their time, make it worth their while. But it's another way that you can get a lot of this valuable feedback is a client advisory board.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. E-commerce does, I don't know if this is where it started, but e-commerce definitely does do this, right? There's oftentimes like the really good and successful direct-to-consumer brands, especially, they'll have some sort of like VIP club or program or whatever. And it's not like a formal advisory board, but they use it as such, right? So they'll have events and then they're like, oh, tell us what you think about XYZ, that kind of stuff. They'll send them extra surveys, and in exchange they'll get extra gift cards, or coupons or that type of thing. So, I mean, e-commerce definitely does a lot of that. But yeah, I think this goes back to the point, Joseph, I think that you were making, like you have to have, like, yes, the upfront customer interviews are great, but you have to have something available to you, one thing or a couple of different things, to consistently keep getting these customer insights. Again, cabs are great, podcasts, webinars, events, like there's a million different ways to do it, but having that continuous thread of customer insights is just critical.
Yeah, and you have to do it in a way that's beneficial to them, where they get something out of it. That's why I've really enjoyed doing podcasts myself and working with our customers on podcasts, because even I know that some people aren't going to get the value that they get out of going on a podcast, but going on a podcast is extremely valuable on a, for you as an individual, for your company that you work for. It's free publicity, and better publicity than you're going to get for any kind of content you're going to create internally, because it's giving you credibility from the external side. So, being invited onto a podcast is really valuable. So when you have one and you're inviting somebody on and you're saying, we want to make you look good, we want to give you an opportunity to talk about your expertise, you are actually giving them something that's really valuable. In exchange, you're learning about them. You're growing rapport with the individual, but then you're also getting customer insights, like every time that you have that call. And not just stakeholders, but then you could also be interviewing people who are tangential in the process that still influence your decision maker, but they're not the direct person. And honestly, that person, those people that have a lot of influence on your decision maker, they're going to be a little bit harder to nail down for a customer interview. And I think something like a podcast is a better way to get information from somebody like that and learn more about how they affect that decision making process in their organization.
Yeah, and this is maybe this is a good place to wrap up and foreshadow maybe a next conversation that we're going to have on the Marketing Talk Radio, Power Hour, whatever. Anyway, title to be determined. Is the full, not committee even, but like those internal influencers, internal and external. And, everybody wants to talk to the decision maker, but you can, within customer interviews, I think it's important to find out who else is involved. And I think this is maybe where we'll kind of create a cliffhanger a bit, because what oftentimes people do is, you hear this both either in discovery, customer interviews, or sales discovery calls. And the question's almost always the same, which is, oh, who else needs to be involved, or who else is usually involved to make this decision? And they'll usually rattle off, oh, blah, 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 blah. And most people go, okay, cool. And maybe they'll ask, oh, should we get them involved, if it's a sales call. The reality is, going back to Joseph, your politics thread that you were bringing up, there's a lot of people that get involved, quote unquote, but their opinions do not freaking matter. Like, they get involved just because of politics. Like, oh, well, we have to involve Sue from accounting, but I don't really give a shit what Sue thinks, right? Her opinion is not actually going to be used to make this decision. But to make her feel good, we'll include her in the meeting, right? This happens all the time. So what's important is you got to dig for whose opinion actually matters, who has clout, who do you really need to influence, who do you really need to build a relationship with. Some of that you can understand and build through the customer interviews, and again, understand who's and again, you can do that by asking a situational question. And this is where things get interesting, right? Because Same reason you ask situational questions in job interviews is the same reason you want to ask them in customer interviews, because it makes them think about an actual thing, and they'll give you real life information rather than what they're thinking about at that moment. So if you ask like, hey, the last time that you made this switch with a vendor, whatever, who was involved? Oh, so-and-so. Okay, well, whose opinion was used to make this decision? Oh, well, really only me and so-and-so. Cool. Thanks.
That is interesting though, and that's definitely we could have another whole episode about that and diving into to those things.
And that is what we'll do. We'll talk about building what we call the relationship pyramid next time. Maybe that's a good topic.
Wow,
all right. Well, thanks everybody for listening to us yammer on for about 50 minutes here. So hopefully this was useful, and join us again next week.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of the Master Marketer Show. We'll be back next week with more B2B marketing success stories. Visit our website, www.proofpoint.marketing, for the full episode library, complete with show notes, guides, templates, and more. Make sure to follow Proofpoint Marketing on LinkedIn and YouTube so you never miss an episode. Listen every Wednesday wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time.